Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of CoinNewsExtra interview session. So it's a program where we invite blockchain and cryptocurrency and people that are in the fintech sector to talk about matters arising and impact they are making in the ecosystem. So today we'll be talking about using emerging tech to solving real-world economic imbalance. And we have an innovator and expert in this field who have a lot of experience in this field. So we have Sofie Blakstad. She is the CEO and founder of Hive Online. Sofie, you are welcome to CoinNewsExtra.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you as well. So we'll be looking at, we know what is happening, and most especially we have a pandemic that is facing the world at this critical moment. So we'll be looking at using emerging tech to solve a real world economic imbalance. We know what is happening, and you have a lot of experience in the banking sector. You know what is happening when it comes to financial imbalance and economic imbalance. So before we move and talk about that, we would like to know briefly about you. Just give us a brief about yourself.
Okay, so thanks very much for that. I spent much of my career in international banking, but I came from a background where I didn't share the same sort of like Oxbridge education as many of the people around me. So I was able to see things in a different way, and I ended up being a banking transformation specialist as well as a technologist. For 8 international banks, and did a lot of banking transformation and rebuilding businesses to be more customer friendly and better for customers. But eventually blockchain came along, and I realized that banks were never going to be able to fully support the most underprivileged customers, and that's why I set up Hive Online. As well as that, I've written a couple of books. My most recent one's called FinTech Revolution. And I also advise the United Nations and various other NGOs and banks on applications of fintech, and particularly blockchain, to sustainable and social impact applications.
Interesting. That is a nice one. So looking at what are some of the economic imbalance in the world today?
Well, wealth and income inequality is a growing challenge everywhere. While we are seeing at a macro scale the growth of the middle classes, that's largely being driven by the growth of the middle classes in China. And inequality is actually increasing in most countries in the world, from the US to most African countries, to Europe. So really nearly everywhere is seeing an increase in inequality. And this reduces the ability of people to be socially mobile in particular. And that in itself also reduces the economic potential of whole nations. So the fact that inequality is growing and people are not able to access quality education and healthcare has really bad long-term implications for the way that economies thrive and behave in the global environment. And as I'm sure you're aware, in Africa there is significant poverty and inequality. Over 1 billion people in the world do not have access to the things that they need in life, basic healthcare and good education and formal financial services. Although financial inclusion has changed a lot and is improving rapidly, there's still 1.7 billion people in the world who do not have access to any kind of formal financial services. And many people, especially women, do not have good quality education. In Niger, where we're working, fewer than 1% of women complete school, which is a really shocking statistic. And that, of course, means that they cannot realize their full potential, and they cannot generationally improve the lives of their children and their children's children. So it's a cycle that's really getting worse at the moment. And of course, COVID has further impacted that, especially in Africa, where a lot of countries are very dependent on exports. And a lot of countries are also quite dependent on remittances, which have also really dried up. So it's impacting Africa, I think, worse than anywhere else at the moment.
Interesting on what some of the challenges that is facing what some of the imbalances in the world, economic imbalances in the world. So we'll be looking at how we've been able to know some of those imbalances. What are some of, before we go to how emerging tech and blockchain could be of importance, we'll be able to know what are some of the traditional approach that the government or some institution have been using to tackle this imbalance.
Yeah, there's been a lot of activity, both globally, nationally, and at a regional level to try to address this. And when I was working at Citigroup, Africa was in my portfolio. And from the banking perspective, you know, we were always trying to reach more customers and provide better quality services for particularly rural customers. But it was always a challenge. I mean, the infrastructure challenges of actually reaching rural areas are so much greater in, you know, in big countries with relatively spread out populations. And and from a governmental perspective, again, actually identifying and counting populations is very difficult, where you don't have universal identification schemes, for example, as in some countries. And you know, there's been a lot done, like the World Bank is obviously lending to governments as well as institutions to try and stimulate economies. There are development banks like the African Development Bank alongside the commercial banking sector. So there is a lot of effort to get development capital into the continent. But I think the most significant development over recent decades has been, of course, the rise of the microfinance institution, which have been set up by a combination of governments, financial institutions, and NGOs to try and plug that gap. And that's had mixed success. You know, there are now opportunities to access capital for more entrepreneurs than there were previously, and for more individuals. But it hasn't been universally successful because the cost of lending is extremely high. Assessing customers, doing KYC, know your customer, is still very expensive in rural areas, especially in areas where there are conflict. And often the cost of lending does not justify reaching particularly rural customers. So what we see is actually, while there has been a significant uptick in people's access to finance as a result of microfinance, there's still a big imbalance between rural and urban and peri-urban areas, where entrepreneurs in urban areas and peri-urban areas are much more likely to be able to access capital than the rural entrepreneurs, and particularly farmers. Is that there are credit institutions that would love to help these entrepreneurs, but the logistics just don't work. The costs are too great, and that results in either very high interest rates or just a complete lack of credit opportunity. And we also see, you know, in terms of collateralized loans, the banks will collect assets like, you know, farming equipment, which of course is completely useless to the banks. And then it means that the entrepreneurs cannot actually, you know, pay back their loans because they can't make a living, and it just doesn't work. So there's been progress, but it's still fundamentally, especially in rural areas, it's still quite broken.
Interesting that there have been progress. So we have advent of emerging techs, we have AI, and we have blockchain. We know what blockchain can do when it comes to finance and how it's playing a role. So how do you think some of these emerging techs can play a role in solving some of this economic imbalance?
Well, I think that AI and blockchain are the two sort of killer technologies when it comes to addressing this problem. If we think about the problem as an infrastructure problem, and also as an analysis problem, so we've got these two issues. One is reaching these populations, and one is analysing these populations. And of course, from an infrastructure perspective, blockchain provides the ability for anyone to have a wallet that has any kind of connectivity on their device. And the AI type analysis allows for analysis of different types of data, so that even people who don't have digital records can build up a KYC equivalent or a credit history proxy based on other facts about them. So, for example, you know, where they are. You've got a GPS location, neural networks about who they interact with. facts about their affiliations and their social activities. And all of these can go towards building up confidence that somebody is really who they say they are, and that they do what they say they do, which of course is what KYC is for. So I think these technologies, individually but in particularly combined, offer huge opportunities for these rural populations.
Thank you very much. Before we draw the curtain on today's episode of CoinNewsExtra interview session, you are the CEO and founder of Hive Online. How are you playing a role with this company?
So we're building what we call community finance solutions based on blockchain and machine learning to help rural populations get access to credit and new markets. Excuse me. And we're doing that with a blockchain-based system, which enables communities of rural entrepreneurs like farmers and women in savings groups to build a reputation based on their activities, which again we store on the blockchain. So it's tamper-proof, it's trustworthy. You can't make these facts up. And we monitor their behaviour in their group activities and in their commercial activities, some of which is financial, but most of which is not financial, and build up this really robust profile of who they are, so that lenders can see that they're reliable and customers can see that they will deliver what they say they deliver. So, for example, in Mozambique, we are measuring the harvests that people are predicting and whether they meet their predictions, as well as their financial transactions. In Niger, we had the ability to measure whether people turn up at savings group meetings, because that's a commitment they've made to the group. And then with the blockchain-based wallet, of course, these groups can build wealth, they can have savings, and they can lend without the need for everyone to have a bank account, or in fact, without the need for anyone to have a bank account. So as well as being able to access the formal system and being able to show to credit providers that they are creditworthy, they can actually manage simple savings lending and peer-to-peer payments without needing a bank account or a mobile money account at all. And that for these particularly the rural ladies who generally don't have access to any kind of formal financial service is really transformational. And for farming communities, it's also transformational because, especially in Mozambique, where we're working, most of the farmers also don't have access to formal financial services. And something that we've had to do because of the poverty of the populations we're working with and their very, very low access to technology, is that we focus very much on the community, and we've allowed individuals who don't necessarily have a device at all to have a wallet, to be able to use the financial system, even though they don't have a phone to access it on. So it means that even the very, very poor people can start to build up reputation and start to build wealth. And that's really transformational.
Indeed, it is, because we know what it is, most especially when in some areas in Africa where it is difficult to access the internet and some other infrastructures.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Sofie Blakstad, for joining us today on CoinNewsExtra interview.
Thank you, it's been a pleasure.